if nothing else. So I want to take my time today to start by talking about a broad sort of research agenda I found myself working on. And then I'm going to pivot and tell you about a new descriptive paper that my graduate student and I finished writing like 2 days ago, which we then posted on the website. This graph is nothing new after Pauline's talk, but there has been this momentous change in how families are organized and how many kids people have that has now taken place or is taking place in all parts of the world. Okay. And in particular, I want to make the argument that this fertility transition, or at least the first fertility transition, as Martha described it, is basically finished for many parts of the world, and is actually quite a bit underway for sub-Saharan Africa, which is sort of a fairly new thing, right? But we're at the point now where it used to be that historical studies of the fertility transition were focused on Western Europe. And now we're at the point where actually for much of the world, looking back at the fertility transition is essentially an object of history. And so this is kind of exciting for me because I have secretly wanted to be an economic historian. But I always found that I was working on data sets that were a little too recent to get me into, the economic history conferences. And so I'm making a pitch to call this economic history. But I'm going to make two more sort of substantive claims about or arguments for why it's useful to note that this is history. So one, sort of on a more pessimistic, self-effacing note, is that all this stuff about future policy and the future of the world population when cities are empty and there are no people around coming up with ideas, right? That maybe my study of these backward-facing issues has less relevance to that future. And so that's sort of something to think about. But more importantly for me, and this sort of piggybacks on Martha's talk, is that we can now look at how many kids people had over their lifetimes and sort of what lifetime social and economic resources they had, and study this from a cohort perspective instead of studying these snapshots in time and how they evolve for whole populations. And so I think that, tracking cohorts and the evolution of outcomes over cohorts is inherently a historical exercise because you have to wait until the cohort ages through the entire exposure period, right? As a result, we can't sort of study the evolution of demographic aggregates in real time and think about and know about what's going to happen to current cohorts. But we can do this historically, and yet most descriptions of the demographic transition have taken a period perspective, have described flows of births, flows of deaths, and tried to understand what determined them. I think, so there are plenty of conceptual debates in the demography literature about which is better. I don't really want to get into that. But I do think that there is a practical reason for this, which is that studies of European history have been hampered by data availability. A lot of the data we have on how many births were happening don't tell us much about the ages or the birth cohorts of the mothers, and so as a result, we end up looking at flows. In low and middle income countries since around 1950, right, there was this big decline in fertility, and demographic researchers were trying to understand it in real time and weren't waiting until women finished their reproductive periods, right? But we're now at a moment where we can actually look back and track what happened across birth cohorts. And sort of develop this new history instead of looking at the evolution of total fertility rates or crude birth rates or something like that, as many studies, not all studies on the demographic transition, but many studies of the demographic transition have done. We can take on this perspective where we take stock of people's lives and what happened over their lives, how many kids they had, what were the outcomes of their kids, what did their spouses look like, and so on. And so I think that's important. So that's especially, I think we have a lot of economists in the room today, and when economists write down the model of fertility choice, the starting point is to say people are choosing how many kids to have, maybe how much they're going to work, how much they're going to invest in their kids, and it's all made together given some, lifetime budget constraints or something like that, right? And so economists are thinking of this as of these things as all linked to each other in a combined decision, right? Which means that we really want to take stock of the lifetime resources of people, their choices of labor supply, and of how much you're investing in their kids, and of how similarly of how they're choosing how many kids to have all together. And this is sort of easiest to do from a cohort perspective, where you're taking these aggregates among groups of people who are all born at the same time. And so yeah, this is conceptually useful, but there are also some really awkward things about attempts to use period data to try to link these different domains that are often associated with fertility decline, right? And so one very popular story in economics that I'm going to talk about more later is that as people increase investments in their children, they decrease the number of kids, right? But if you try to match, say, school enrollment rates at a point in time with the total fertility rate at a point in time, the kids inside the school enrollment rates don't necessarily have parents who are represented in the total fertility rate. And so, and then if you try to study how those change over time within the population, you're mixing together all these families and the measures, and it's really hard to make sense of what's going on, right? And when you split up the population by, say, the mother's birth cohort, you get to keep track of who is it from which family, and it all sort of coheres a lot better. And so the sort of broader research agenda I've been working on is to just basically try to document basic facts about the cohort fertility transition and what accompanied it, as a way to motivate sort of applied micro research that investigates specific causes, and also sort of quantitative macro research that sort of needs moments to calibrate models, and these moments can help. Good. Okay. So I have been on this mission sort of to assemble all of these cohort facts about fertility change. I've listed a couple of past papers. One which I'll reference later today on comparing the results I'll show you today with what has happened in Africa over the past 30 or so years. Okay. But what I'm going to show you today is about developing this cohort portrait of fertility change in the 20th century in Latin America, and hopefully convinces you that there is much yet to be learned by looking back at the completed experiences of these birth cohorts. Okay, so for the rest of today's talk, I'm going to discuss this new descriptive paper on cohort fertility change in Latin America that's joint with one of my graduate students named Regina Caius who is at UCSD. She'll be on the job market in a couple of years, and you should be on the lookout for her. She's great. So what we're going to do is combine a bunch of census microdata from IPAMS International. So we've put together 63 censuses from 17 countries. And these 17 countries represent all Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries in continental Latin America. So the Caribbean representation across countries was very, very spotty. And so we ended up just deciding to focus on the continent. And what we're going to do is construct these cohort histories of fertility change, as well as changes in socioeconomic circumstances and other demographic patterns for women who are past the reproductive period. So we're going to start by charting out cohort trends for 45 to 59-year-olds. Later on, when we analyze correlations with other variables, we're going to focus on women in a narrower age range so that we can study labor supply and so on, and have it be and not have to worry much about age effects in the other variables. Okay. And then alongside that, we're going to look at kids who are linked through their households to women from the same birth cohorts. Okay. And we're going to look at whether they're in school, whether they're working, whether they're literate, whether they finish primary school. We're going to focus on this pretty narrow age range in kids because younger than this, you lose information on primary school completion and work in many countries. And older than 15, kids start to leave the household, and then you start having selectivity into which ones can be matched with their moms. And so we're going to take both of these groups, women and actually their husbands who are matched with them, as well as kids who are matched with their moms, and we're going to aggregate them into national birth cohorts or regional birth cohorts by the woman's 5-year period of birth, going from the 1920s up to the late 1970s. Okay, so that's a lot of boring talk about the data. Let's actually show you some of the data. So here are changes in completed fertility, both ever born down here, number of children ever born on average, and the number of surviving kids. So the number of kids who survived till the woman was age 45 to 59. Okay, across all Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries in North, Central, and South America. Okay, so a few patterns you can notice here. One is that the vast majority of countries had quite substantial declines in cohort fertility during this time. Okay, for Costa Rica, you go from 6.5 down to below 3 between cohorts of the 1920s and cohorts of the 1960s. Similar changes in many of the other countries as well. Okay, you also see that there was a decline in mortality that accompanied this decline in fertility, because these red curves and these blue curves are converging over time. That means that fewer children are dying before the woman reaches middle age. Okay. And then the final thing I want to note is there are 2 countries here that stand out as different from the rest, which is Argentina and Uruguay, which had already essentially completed their first demographic transitions before these censuses were collected. Right? That is broadly known. They transitioned much earlier than the rest of the region. And so as a result, at some point, I'm going to pull them out of the analysis because they're not going to tell us very much about the process of fertility.
How come the Argentine data gets cut off?
That's because the last census in IFUNS was in the 90s. So we don't have we don't have later data to capture women when they're 45 to 50.
They needed all that paper to print money.
The other thing that's really interesting here, Tom, is that for Argentina and Uruguay, at least, there's no baby boom, right? Those cohorts would have been your baby boom cohorts. And so
Yeah.
even if they had reached low fertility beforehand, they're not increasing, or at least not by much.
Yeah. Yes. I guess we can talk more about that.
Okay, or you think there is a baby boom that we don't?
No, I don't. Actually, this was working on this paper was the first time I thought about Argentine and Uruguayan fertility. So lots to learn.
Is there any hope of getting sort of modern register data or other sources for Argentina or Uruguay? For example, recent surveys that could help fill in the gaps for some of the more recent periods?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But what I'm going to say right now is that I'm actually interested in this part.
Yeah.
And so there is not much hope of going back farther to earlier cohorts in Argentina to learn about this process learning. Okay, so a big part of what we're going to do is split up these countries into subnational birthplaces. Okay, so one important thing here is we're going to define these regional birth cohorts for women by where they were born. So they're not going to select into where they're living, for example. They're going to be born in a place, and we're going to look at the lifetime fertility and other outcomes of women who were born in the same subnational region. So these are all first level subnational regions, so states or departments. Okay, you can see that they vary a lot in size across countries and even within countries. Okay, so they're not all the same size, but they're all administratively all trying to get at the same thing. Okay. Point number 1 here, I can draw maps. That's nice. Okay. And the maps vary in color, which means that there is interesting variation to think about both across countries and within countries in terms of the pace of fertility decline. So basically, the darker areas experience faster fertility decline over the sample cohorts from that country. And the lighter areas experience less fertility decline, or slower fertility decline. Okay. If you want some, yes, and
Don't you have a lot of foreign-born people?
these are only domestic born women.
Okay, and did the foreign-born women behave differently or the same or what?
That is a good question. I do not have, I have not, I threw them out of the data set and didn't look carefully at them, but I can. There certainly were immigration waves to Latin America during this period, and so I could think about that for sure. Yeah.
Can you somehow link it to indigenous versus non-indigenous people?
That's interesting. In some countries,
Yes.
in some countries, they ask what language is spoken, and that could tell you something about indigenous.
Maybe like using the geographic distribution
Yeah.
patterns, given the
Yeah.
concentration of
That's a great
indigenous populations.
Yeah, we should consider it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Do they have data on nativity, so you could restrict people who were always in that region to kind of get at the migration of individuals? Because if I understand correctly, you take a woman in a region who's like 50 and you look and see what her fertility history was, but you don't know where she was over the
No.
whole.
I look at a woman who was born in the region,
If born in a region,
regardless of where as long as she's still living in the same country.
yes,
Um,
but could be in a different region.
she could be in a different
Okay.
region, and I'll actually look at migration.
Yeah.
Cross-regional
Great.
migration. Okay, so if we want to look at where the darker colors are, where more fertility decline happened, there's a bit of a weird pattern, which I just want to note as a caveat, which is that we are getting a particular snapshot of fertility decline, right? And fertility decline had actually happened already in the big metropolises of Latin America, and so Sao Paulo is around here, right? And the darker areas in Brazil are in the northeast. So actually, a lot of the fertility decline in the big booming cities of Latin America had happened earlier before these cohorts, right? And you can see in Mexico too. So this is a little hard to see on this projector, but this area here is dark blue, whereas Mexico City is a little bit less dark. Okay, and that's sort of a within country version of the same thing that happened with Argentina and Uruguay, which you can see here are uniformly not changing very much across these sample cohorts. And so actually for the rest of the analysis, when I'm going to try to relate these rates of change to other socioeconomic and demographic aggregates and how they change, I'm going to drop Argentina and Uruguay from the analysis. Okay, and so
Urbanization is a part of the picture.
urbanization will be part of the picture too. I'll show you some back in urbanization. Okay, so the goal here is not going to be to estimate causal effects. The goal is basically going to be to try to document what changes accompany these cohort fertility transitions. Okay? Just some basic facts, which can generate or sort of complement existing hypotheses, which can then help discipline the way we think about writing down models or the way we think about specifying new research designs to study the causal pathways through which these sorts of things happen. Okay. And so I'm going to think about, in the paper, we think about more demographic and socioeconomic phenomena than I'll be able to tell you about today. I dropped two of them, so these ones I won't talk about today in the interest of time. I left a lot of them. I probably won't be able to talk about all of these either, but I left them in the slides because I'm very optimistic. Okay, and so one thing to note about this very long list of phenomena that I want to link with fertility decline is that most of these things are jointly determined with fertility. Okay, so that's like one sense in which I'm being very, very clear that we're not thinking about one thing causing another thing, right? And so, if you want to think about labor supply and how it relates to fertility, people are making those decisions jointly. And so as a result of that, I don't think it makes much sense to throw all these things onto the right-hand side of one regression, because it's really hard to make sense of what we're supposed to take out of a regression where we throw a bunch of endogenous variables on the right-hand side. Instead, what I'm going to try to do is think about these domains separately and just ask, if we compare regions that were declining at different times, do the periods or the cohorts in which fertility was declining, does that coincide with a change in female labor supply, or a change in women's education, or a change in child investment, and so on? Okay, so just to document these basic, bivariate facts about which variables co-moved with fertility change. And so I'm going to do this through a series of fixed effect regressions where I'm going to regress some average outcomes, say children ever born, for region J from country K and cohort T, okay, on some average covariate for that same regional cohort. And then I'm going to include region fixed effects. So we're going to be thinking about within region changes or within region variation, these variables. And then a cohort fixed effect, which I'm either going to restrict to only looking at comparing regions within the same country. So here I've specified this as a country cohort fixed effect. So that basically means that we're comparing rates of change within region, but only comparing those rates of change of one region to other regions within the same country. Okay. But I'll also report specifications where I allow this cohort effect, or I force the cohort effect to be the same for all countries. And so then we're comparing, a change in one region in Brazil with a change in a region in Mexico as well. So I'm going to report both of these specifications, and the basic idea is to relate within region changes in X to within region changes in Y, net of broader cohort trends, where broader means either country level cohort trends or continent level cohort trends.
Can you just clarify, are you going to look at the mean number of children ever born, or say as your Y, or are you going to look at changes in that? Just what's your dependent
Yeah,
variable?
so mostly I've been a little loose about this because when I move to looking at kids, I'm gonna swap things around a little bit because it's conventional to put family side on the right hand side when we're looking at kids. But yes, this is going to be average children ever born, or average number of surviving kids, and this is going to be average education or female labor force participation rate or something like that. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through. I have until when, Natalie?
I'm gonna give you an extra 5 minutes because we saw to wait till 12:25.
12:25. Oh, I have plenty of time.
If you want, I can give you 5-10 minute warning.
Sure. Warnings are good because I don't pay attention. Good. Okay. So I'm basically going to now go through a series of these domains in which I show you a graph of the national cohort time series on one slide, and I say a little bit about sort of what's been said about this topic and how it relates to fertility, and then I'll show you some regression estimates and talk about what we can learn from them, and then we'll go to another topic and so on. Okay. So the first is mortality. Okay. As Pauline had mentioned, right, mortality decline is sort of a fundamental part of demographic transition theory, right? And it's pretty well accepted now that, like, overall, as mortality has declined, fertility has at some point declined as well, right? But if we want to look carefully at it, there are still some open questions about whether mortality decline just causes a decline in the number of kids born to make up for kids who had died, right? As simple, I guess I would say, mechanical sort of replacement, or if there's also an effect of mortality decline on demand for surviving kids, right? Through, for example, a desire under high mortality conditions to have enough kids to accumulate, I guess, a buffer stock of kids so that you have at least one when you reach old age or something. And so there's a question of like, as mortality declines, does gross fertility decline or ever-born fertility decline, or do you also see declines in net or fertility net of mortality? Okay. There are some nice econ papers on this topic. So Matthias Dobke has a great quantitative theory piece in which he goes through a bunch of different fertility models and calibrates them, and ends up concluding that there's little case for the demand for surviving children declining as a result of mortality decline, and instead it's just a story of people adjusting to offset the declining risk directly. Okay. And there's some nice recent applied micro research. This paper is on smallpox vaccination in Sweden, in which they also find that a reduction in exogenous reduction in mortality risk led to basically a 1-for-1 reduction in fertility rates, but no reduction in surviving fertility. So the idea is that parents are just adjusting sort of linearly to mortality risk and not taking away some precautionary demand for kids that have been there in the past. And so, what I'm going to present you now is not going to speak to these causal effects of mortality risk on fertility, on ever-born and surviving fertility, but will give us a sort of useful descriptive fact, basically about whether the decline in mortality whether the decline in fertility was so rapid that it outpaced the decline in mortality. Right? In that case, you would see surviving fertility go down when mortality goes down. Okay? And a preview, that's not what we're going to find. Consistent with those existing papers, we're going to find that as the share of children who died declines, we're going to see the overall number of kids decline, but not the number of surviving kids. Okay, and that's what you see here. So here's the regression with continent-wide cohort effects, and here's the regression with country-specific cohort effects. Okay, and you can see that there's a positive relation between the share of children who died and children ever born. That means that as mortality shares decline across successive cohorts within a place, okay, the average number of children also declines. Okay. Yes.
Clarification. So the children ever born is for women 45 to whatever 60,
okay.
And the shared disease is computed for those.
For the same women. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I mean, these are all. I mean, in a sense, you can just look at children ever born surviving kids, and you can back out these results as well. But running the regression like this, I think helps make clear to us that that the gap between these is shrinking in a way such that mortality decline is basically outpacing fertility decline. Okay, so there are positive coefficients here implying that there's a. But yes, for sure, we don't want to look at this and say that mortality decline is causing fertility decline, because there's a lot of circularity here. Okay, and so, but then if we look at surviving kids, right? If anything, the number of surviving children goes up as mortality declines, right? Which basically means that kids are being saved by mortality decline, and so that means that you can get an increase in survival fertility. Okay? But it's not the case that as mortality declines, the number of surviving kids is shrinking as well. Now, if you wanted to do an accounting exercise, I'm going to do these accounting exercises on each of these slides, where basically based on like sample-wide cohort effects, to ask like, if we were to multiply these coefficients by the first cohort versus last cohort difference in mortality shares, and then then ask what share of first cohort versus last cohort fertility does that explain, you can get like 50 to 100%, right? But that's just to say that these coefficients are big relative to the observed decline in the mean. Okay, let me move on to things that are a little less circular, and they will make Adriana less upset at me. So there's been a lot of thinking about urbanization and its relation to fertility change. Okay, so it's long been observed, both in the West and in low and middle income countries around the world, that folks in rural areas tend to have more kids than folks in urban areas. Okay, now we can ask this in a changes or within place variation over time framework, right? And so we can ask whether urbanization in Latin America predicted fertility decline. Okay. Now, a lot of urbanization had already happened before these censuses were collected. Okay. But even across these cohorts, you can actually see substantial increases in the share living in urban areas when they're interviewed for the census. Okay. Such that in many countries, you get, like a 20 to 25 percentage point increase in urbanization rates across countries across cohorts within single countries. So this is really nice, I think, to do this at the cohort level, Because at the period level, when you're looking at, say, changes within a place in urbanization and changes within a place in fertility, you have to start to wonder, okay, well, part of urbanization comes from people moving into the place, right? And you have to start worrying about who selects into moving into the place, what are their fertility practices that they're bringing with them, and so on. And when we define these cohorts in this way, by the woman's birthplace, right, we don't have to worry about that form of selection. And so indeed, urbanization can happen through a place urbanizing sort of naturally, or it can happen through people moving from far away and coming into an urban center. Okay. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to disentangle those specifically, but I am going to be able to say we, I should say, are going to be able to say something about migration in general. So this is going to be migration across these subnational regions. Okay. Urbanization is defined by the share of the region living in a city, basically, living in an urban locality, and migration is going to be defined by moving across regions. And so these are not the same thing, but we thought they were similar enough that we want to put them in the same section of the talk. And so one thing to note here is that interregional migration is not changing the model. Right? So it's good. It's an interesting thing to add on, but it's not going to explain a large share of fertility decline because these red lines here, which are the share of women not living in their birth regions, is not changing a lot.
It's like the size of the state, or like how big are these regions, just to.
Yeah, they vary a lot, right? So
Some states
I
represent
mean,
states are very
you
big.
can fit multiple Central American countries into lots of
But no
lots
one
of
lives in
fertility
those
states.
places. Or like.
I mean,
less
a lot of people live in these places, yeah, I guess the entire population of Sao Paulo is larger than.
Yeah.
So region, how is region defined?
So these are first level administrative divisions. So they're states in Mexico or Brazil, or departments in Colombia, right? And so on.
So I know this is kind of constrained by how granular the different censuses are in different countries. And I'm just wondering, I know in Mexico, at least in the recent censuses, it's like municipality level, like it's.
Mexico does not ask about municipality of birth.
I see.
Just like the US does not ask
I
about
see.
county of birth, but some censuses do ask about binary geographies.
Yeah, that was.
I'm currently working on a project that's focused more on migration. With my former student Showmanship Strategy, where we're focusing on just those censuses where we get binary geographies. But here, to have a level playing field with.
Yeah, I was wondering if, would the historical migration look a lot different if you focused on the places where you have really disaggregated geographies?
Yeah,
'Cause
stay
it's
tuned
not
on
like
that. We're working
shocking
on
to
it.
me that people
Yeah.
aren't moving across these
Yeah.
big states.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
But you might move to the city.
But I should also say that so we are working on that in a different project. But I should also say that it's not surprising. It's not surprising that the urbanization level was already pretty high here because Latin America urbanized a lot earlier than some other parts. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay, we have here again for children ever born, for surviving children, with the continent-wide cohort effects, or with the country cohort, the country-specific cohort effects, you get consistently negative and statistically significant coefficients on the share urban, which means that as a subnational region urbanizes, right, as the people born in the subnational region become successively more urban across cohorts, right, fertility falls, right? So these coefficients are large enough if you multiply them with the sample-wide cohort changes to account for about 10% of fertility decline. Okay? So not a huge share, but I think a meaningfully large share. And so this coincides with everything that we know about urban-rural differences in fertility, right? Like if you looked at the difference between urban areas and rural areas, and you said, well, if we were to extrapolate this to say maybe this is what happens over time or across cohorts as well, you would end up with similar conclusions, right? The thing that's kind of surprising here is that actually, as migration shares increase, fertility goes up, right? Which is not something that we had thought about before, or something that seems obviously related to existing theory.
This is migration into the place or out of the place?
This is the share of women who were born, say, in New York State, who are no longer living in New York State.
So it's an out migration.
Out migration.
Out migration increases, fertility increases. That's the reason.
Yes, among all the people who were born in that.
But is that like capturing something about like socioeconomics? Like this is like a poor area that everybody wants to leave and they also have a lot of kids.
Yeah, so this is the point where we get to wanting to throw a bunch of stuff on the right-hand side. And I've done some of that, but like it has to be done very delicately. You need to think carefully about.
Because
what-
all
what-
these things are
yeah,
very cool.
Yeah, that's right. This result stands up to including women's education, which we're going to see is like a very important predictor and is less problematic than.
Can I ask you another annoying correlation question? So like how much is shale urban the same as like shale agricultural?
Yeah, I'll show you that in a
You
second
can
too.
tell I love to ask.
So the share urban is very correlated with the share agricultural. It is way less well defined because these urban definitions are very, very different across different countries, right? So some countries will have a population standard like, above 2,500 population, which is a pretty standard thing. But in Colombia, I'm talking about Colombia a lot because we have some Colombians in the room. They just take whatever the head town is of the municipality, right? The share of people living in that head town, no matter how big it is, it's smaller, right? And so those are two very, very different concepts. And so maybe we want to focus on the share agricultural, which I'll show you in a little bit. Yeah.
Is there a way to tease apart this like migration thing, whether it's the people who are moving that are then having more kids or the people that are staying and it just happens to be?
This is exactly the project I'm working on with a spatial trade guy, and so we were exactly thinking about this issue in the censuses that allow us to do this for much smaller geography. So stay tuned, but I don't have an answer yet.
There's a sense in which there may be understatement of the urbanization force, which is these are also countries that are very centralized. So they may have near cities a lot of non-urban areas that are attractive to people because just like the government provides their education, but they remain in agriculture.
It's a good point. Okay, so I'm just continuing to move forward so that I get through as many of these domains as I can. So adult education, specifically women's education, right? This is like one of the strongest correlates of fertility across the world. That in cross sections of people, in cross sections of countries, we see that places with more educated women or more educated women within those populations have fewer kids. Okay. And so this was a period in Latin America where education grew a lot across cohorts, both for men and for women, as you can see here. So the blue is for women and the red is for their husbands. Okay. And so we want to ask, right, as these increases happen, or in places where the increases happen more rapidly or more strongly, do we see more fertility decline? And so because these changes are so correlated between women and their husbands, we'll also include husbands' education, but consistent with the existing literature, everything is going to load onto women and not much on that. So when we run this, we find that every additional year of education that's added across cohorts within the place for women is associated with a reduction of about a third of a kid due to fertility. This is a really, really big thing quantitatively. Okay, so if you multiply this by sample-wide cross-cohort changes in women's education, you end up accounting for over half, sometimes substantially more than half, depending on which of these coefficients you use, of the observed decline of fertility, right? And so this is consistent. In my work on cohort fertility change in Africa, I find very similar patterns, actually quite similar magnitude as well, that women's education is really a big part of the story here. And actually, this is the one domain where I actually feel more comfortable putting this on the right-hand side of the regression and saying that this looks like a normal regression, right? There are still concerns about omitted variable bias, right? About the usual identification things, but this is not this. We mostly should not think about this as being jointly determined with fertility in adulthood, right? This is something that's set mostly before people are making their fertility decisions. And so meanwhile, consistent with all cuts of the data that you can do cross-sectional, cross-country, and so on, right? Husband education doesn't seem to relate very strongly to completed triple. Okay, going on. I now want to talk a little bit about labor. So the education patterns, right? I'm in a room filled with mostly economists and a few social demographers. I think that mostly covers the room. And so women's education, right, is something that like is often thought, like economists look at it and they think about, oh well, more educated women have higher wages, and that's the whole story, right? But there are all these other things which I actually didn't mention here, but there are all sorts of other things about how people's ideas about optimal families, about the rights of men and women, about investing in kids and so on change as women get more educated, right? So there's a very broad range of mechanisms through which women's education might be thought to affect the fertility and or the demand for children. But one of them that has been emphasized a lot in econ since Gary Becker started writing on these topics was that maybe it's that more educated women have higher opportunity costs of time because they have higher wages. Right? This is more generally linked with the idea that as labor market opportunities for women improve, you would expect to see fertility decline. Okay. And so we're going to show some evidence on how the prevalence of women's work is related to fertility decline across cohorts. Okay. Again, we're not going to have some exogenous driver of women's labor force participation, but it's still very useful just to have some basic facts on whether these two things are related. I note that up until this point, I have basically said it's useful to have this basic fact on whether these two things are related, and I've said they are related. But at the end of the talk, I'm going to show you one thing where a relation that we expected to be there is actually not going to be there, and I'll hopefully have 30 seconds to tell you why that's interesting and what we should do with it theoretically. Yeah. So we're going to look at women's labor force participation, which increased very substantially. So this is labor force participation among 45 to 49-year-olds, so all at the same point in their life cycles. Okay, you see it's rising very significantly in most countries. Okay. And on the other side, we're going to look at the sectoral composition of husbands' employment, specifically the share in agriculture. Okay, now we're just looking at these two because if we look at the share of husbands working, it'd be 100% uniformly, and if we look at the share of women working in agriculture, it'd be like 0 uniformly. And so we're just focusing on these on basically the share working among women and the sectoral composition of husbands who are working, because that's where we have action. And you see that there's a lot of movement out of agriculture during this time. Okay, so in Bolivia, you go from 60% of men employed in agriculture to 30, in Brazil from 50 down to 20, and so on. And so separately, there are a bunch of interesting theories about how structural transformation relates to the demand for children and the organization of families. And so when we run these regressions, we find actually that both things, changes in both of these dimensions of the labor market are strongly correlated with changes in fertility. So as more women start working, you start to see fertility decline. And as more men shift out of agriculture, right, you also start to see as more men shift out of agriculture, you start to see fertility decline because these coefficients are positive. Okay. Now these can account for, again, between 10 and 20% of the observed fertility decline sample wide, right? Not huge, but quantitatively meaningful, and worth paying attention to as we formulate theories moving forward. Okay, so the final thing I want to talk about, and the one case where I'm going to say we would expect to see these things related, but we don't, is for child outcomes. So there's been a lot of interest, both inside economics and outside economics. So most of the people in this room know about Gary Becker's theory of the quality and quantity of children, but there's also really nice work by Jack Caldwell, who is a demographer, positing some similar relationships about how we should expect to see fertility falling at the same time that we see more kids in school, right? And so, you know, in the data, we do indeed see that there was quite a lot of increase in schooling among kids. So these, by the way, these kids are indexed by the birth years and birthplaces of their mothers, right? And so you can see, right, especially on school enrollment and primary completion, these are the blue and the blue squares and gray triangle. You can see that there are increases in these variables in many contexts. Okay, if you squint, I mean the scale is very large, but if you squint, you can see declines in child work. Literacy is pretty near universal in many of these countries at these ages already. So. So the literacy increases are not quite as widespread. Okay, so we're basically going to try to look at these and ask, you know, were these increases in measures of child investment correlated with decreases in fertility across families, right? And this is a place where I think it's really useful to be able to link kids with their mom's birth cohorts, because we're looking at the same set of families. We're not mixing together, you know, a set of kids in the population with a set of parents in the population and not have them be the same. Okay.
Just a question,
yeah.
you're observing kids who are still co-resident with their
That's
parents
right.
because you're using the census, right?
I'm using the census, and that's why I'm not looking past age 15, because we have an appendix figure that shows after age 15 the co-residence rate drops. And so I did this exercise in sub-Saharan Africa already. It's at long last, coming out like next month, finally. And in sub-Saharan Africa, these two things are not related to each other. Okay, so the places in sub-Saharan Africa that have seen the most fertility decline over the past 20 or 30 years are just not the same places that have seen the most growth in schooling, in kids schooling. Okay, they have seen a large increase in women's education, just like we saw here, but they're not the same for kids, right? That's also related. I mean, Pauline talked a little bit about work on the quality quantity trade-off in economics. I'd say that the evidence for the quality quantity trade-off is very shaky. We don't really like we can have debates about whether it exists or not. There's some evidence that we can say supports the quality quantity trade-off. Other evidence, for instance, based on dropping kids randomly into families with twin designs or whatever, right? That don't find trade-offs, right? And so, you know, the basis for these theories is intricate, I would say, or delicate. Yes,
5 minutes,
Yeah.
but I'll also ask you a question if you have time. So I think a lot of the expansions of schooling in low-income countries have to do with like big expansions of supply, right? Like
That's
making
exactly right.
universal primary school
Yeah.
available, and so it's in some sense that probably like reduces the cost of human capital investment, but it's not clearly saying that the returns of human capital investment are going up. So do we think of this as kind of white tool to test for the quantity quality?
It may not be. It may not be. And in fact, I would go further than that and say that like it's not entirely clear how we should model the government opening up schools, right? They're providing childcare, right? Which works in a totally different way if you write that model, right? Or they could be seen as like increasing the endowment of human capital of a kid with no cost to the parent, right? Instead of changing the price, right? And all these things work very differently when you write that model. Okay? And so I'll return to that at the end of the talk, right? But for right now, I just want to say, like, what happened to kids schooling as their moms started having fewer kids? And the answer is not much. Okay, so if you squint, you can see a few coefficients. So this is a meaningfully large coefficient that again would get you in like, sorry, so let me say first, this is regressing children's outcomes on the fertility of their moms, okay, or the fertility of their moms' cohorts. We flip things around now. That's just because in the literature on children's outcomes and family size, the convention is to put children's outcomes on the left-hand side. These are jointly determined, so it's arbitrary which one we put on the right and which one we put on the left, but that's the convention, so we follow the same thing, okay? But the point here is that there are a lot of zeros. There are very few t-statistics above 2, and there are even sign flips, okay? So reductions in family size are associated with declines in literacy. The coefficient is positive for literacy, okay? For the primary completion rate and for the enrollment rate, you can find some negative coefficients, but it's really, you know, these are not consistent results that make you confident that these two changes, you know, having more kids in school and not working, and moms having fewer kids, go hand in hand, right? There doesn't seem to be, something deeply systematic here. Okay? And so, this makes one conclude that like it's hard to see a relationship between changes in child quality and changes in child quantity, right? Within places across cultures. Okay, so I'm going to put that on the table, but I'll return to it because I remember Natalie's question. I probably have like a couple minutes left. Perfect. So some big picture takeaways. So one, just going back to the beginning, as in sort of quantitative theory and in sort of well-identified causal work from economics, fertility decline didn't outpace mortality decline. So the number of surviving kids doesn't move down faster than the mortality rate. Okay. Then as in other contexts, like in sub-Saharan Africa, where I've done a very similar exercise, rising women's education is a very, very strong and very quantitatively important as sort of a variance share would tell us, determinant of fertility decline. We see rising women's work and movement out of agriculture as being important too. But the big surprising thing is that fertility decline was not systematically associated with changes in how many kids were in school, how many kids were finishing school, how many kids were literate, how many kids were working. Okay, so this, as I told you, is similar to what we see in sub-Saharan Africa more recently. Okay, and it's challenging for people like me who enjoy writing down quality quantity models as a way to understand how the world has shifted from having lots and lots of kids in every family to having few kids.
Can I just ask you about this, interpreting this, or maybe you want to wrap up and we talk and then how are we doing?
We are at 0 minutes.
Okay, I'll let
So
you
let
wrap
me-
up and we'll talk.
so let me
about it.
just-
Yeah,
So it's possible to get this to happen in a model with a quality quantity trade-off, right? One way is through having schools come from outside and not be due to parental decisions, and to change the budget constraint in the ways that we described that are not the way that in the first time learning about quality quantity models we learned to think about schooling, right? Or another way is that these changes in schooling can happen alongside, say, changes in preferences or changes in bargaining power between men and women, so that they end up canceling out, and the increase in schooling doesn't map onto the fertility change in the way we would expect. That being said, while it's possible to write down a model with this trade-off such that we observe these data, it is nuanced, and it is hard to then argue that this is an important driver of fertility change over the past half century. And so more generally, many of these facts would be a lot more muddled to interpret in period data because of these issues of mismatch and life cycles and cohorts and so on. And so I think or hope that they provide some useful facts for you all to think about as you go out and try to write down quantitative models or try to test specific theories of fertility change. Thanks a lot.